Do you need to pay the extra 3% additional SDLT charge? When it comes to property purchases and the associated taxes, things can be a little bit complicated because it's not something that people deal with every single day, because you don't buy a property every single day. Or if you do, you're doing really well, by the way, and congratulations. One common question that often arises is, are you obligated to pay the additional 3% SDLT when you plan to live in a property you're buying? So let's look at this particular scenario. The concept of the main residence replacement exception is pivotal when it comes to determining whether you're liable for the additional 3% SDLT or not, as the case may be. If a property that you're acquiring is intended to replace your current main residence, then you're in a good position. In this scenario, you won't pay the additional 3% surcharge. This is because you have no second or additional property, so no additional SDLT is payable. However, you have to sell your initial home to avoid the 3% charge. To qualify for this, you must not only be purchasing a new main residence, but also be in the process of selling your existing or previous main residence at the same time. You must sell your initial home within 3 years of making the purchase. If you do then initially pay the 3% SDLT, you can then make a reclaim. Alternatively, you can sell your initial home first and then you can buy the new home, and you won't have to pay the 3% SDLT charge, and there's no process that you have to go through to do the reclaim because you've already sold your main home. Multiple property ownership. The situation becomes more complicated if you already own multiple properties. In such cases, when you complete a transaction for a new property, the additional 3% surcharge becomes due because you're buying an additional property, even if you have the intention to sell your previous property at a later point in time. This happens because until you successfully dispose your old property, you technically own multiple properties. It's a situation where the law is keen on establishing between those who genuinely are replacing their home and those who might end up having two properties, and one of those becomes a buy-to-let. This rule extends to individuals who own and rent properties in their own name also. Essentially, if you are an owner of more than one property, you should be prepared to pay the additional 3% SDLT at the time of purchasing your new property because you have no choice over it. That's what the rules say. Can the additional SDLT be reclaimed? Now, if you find yourself in a situation where you've paid the 3% surcharge due to having multiple properties but intend to rectify it by selling your old property, then you still have an opportunity. You can potentially reclaim the additional 3% SDLT if you meet particular criteria, primarily based on two significant 3-year tests. Number 1, intent to reside. At the time of the new property purchase, your genuine intent should have been to reside in it as your primary or your main sole residence. This demonstrates that you never intended to hold both properties, one of them obviously being for investment purposes. Number 2, disposal of the old property. The major interest in the initial dwelling should have been disposed of either before or on the date of the new property being purchased, with no major interest held in the sold dwelling immediately following the disposal by you, your civil partner or spouse. The disposal should have occurred no earlier than 3 years before the new property has been purchased. These tests aim to ensure that the reclaim of the additional SDLT is genuinely linked to the intention of using your new property as your main and sole residence, and not as a means to exploit the tax rules, because we'd never recommend you do that because that gets you in trouble. Delays in selling the previous property. It's important to address this scenario because there can be delays in selling your existing home even though you might have bought your new one. This can happen quite often because properties are sold at different times. In this case, you will likely have to pay the additional 3% SDLT on the new home that you've purchased because you technically own two properties at that time, and then you basically have 3 years in which to sell your old main residence, and if you do that, you can then reclaim the additional 3% because you only have one home left at the end. And when you want to request a refund, if you meet the criteria for the refund of the additional 3% SDLT charge, you'll need to write into HMRC explaining why the sale of the old property took so long to complete, and in that particular letter you should include the following: the primary purchaser's details if that is different for any particular reason, all details linked to the circumstances that prevented your old property from being sold, information about the property on which the additional 3% was paid, such as the purchase date, the address, the unique tax reference number of the SDLT return, details of your former residence, its address, sale date and SDLT UTR. And of course you also need to share with them how much additional SDLT was paid and make it clear how much you want to reclaim. You need to give them the sort code and account number of the individual who will receive the payment, otherwise the payment won't come through or the repayment won't come through. It's worth noting that the ability to request a refund applies to individual purchases and not to housing associations, limited companies or those acquiring property in conjunction with specific institutions. The rules for such entities may differ significantly. Determining your main residence. Unlike other taxes, you don't have the luxury of selecting which property is your main residence for SDLT purposes because it's based on a matter of fact. If you live in only one home, that's your default main residence. However, if you spend time at multiple properties, you can then elect which property is your main residence. There are a number of factors that you need to consider when deciding your main residence, and some of those are as follows. Where your family spends most of their time, at which property are you on the electoral roll, and your registration with a doctor, dentist, so on and so forth. If you have a personal faith, if you go to a local church, mosque, synagogue, gurdwara, temple, so on and so forth. If you're involved in the local community by working with a particular charity, that type of stuff, these things demonstrate that you intend to live there and you're going to live there for the foreseeable future or for some time. Now this list isn't exhaustive. I could have added quite a few other things on there, but that kind of gives you the gist of what HMRC would look at.